Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Shana Marshall. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute for Middle East Studies at GW, and I am very excited to have our guests with us today to discuss this really excellent and timely new book, Egypt's New Authoritarian Republic. I will briefly introduce the speakers. And then we will have some overviews of the book itself, and then some of the contributors will speak specifically to their own chapter contributions. And then we will open it up for questions and answers. We do have the Q&A button at the bottom. At any time, please put your questions in there. I will moderate that Q&A session, so you don't have to wait until the discussion is finished to post those questions. You can do that anytime. And in the chat, you'll see a link to the book, as well as a link to the website of the Institute for Middle East Studies, where you can see all our upcoming event lineup. So first, we have Robert Springborg. He is a research fellow at the Italian Institute of International Affairs and an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University. He served as one of the two editors on this volume and contributed a chapter titled Legitimacy Without Economic Growth, which examines the very poor record of Sisi's government in terms of improving living standards for working and middle-class Egyptians. And he'll tell us what the implications of that are for regime longevity. We also have Nathan Brown. He is Assistant Dean of Graduate Studies and a Professor of Political Science and International Affairs here at GW's Elliott School of International Affairs. His contribution in this edited volume is titled Reflections on Egyptian Politics Since 2013. And that examines the way that Sisi's rule has intentionally sought to sort of erode the institutional and the ideational distinctions between Sisi as ruler with the broader regime and the state itself in Egypt. And we also have May Darwich. She is Associate Professor of International Relations of the Middle East at the University of Birmingham. Her chapter deals with Egypt's declining role in regional foreign policy and its capacity for power projection by examining a few critical issues like the Nile River Dam and regional instability and a number of other issues. We cannot be joined today by the other co-editor of the volume, Abd al Fattah, but he is a professor and chair of the Unit of State and Political Systems Studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. We're very disappointed that he couldn't join us today, but he was not only a co-editor, but also did a lot of the work of the volume itself. He contributed several chapters, so I'll really encourage all of you to go out and get that book and examine those contributions also. I'll start just with a sort of a brief comment before I turn it over to Robert Springborg to introduce the volume a little bit more. As I'm reflecting on the sort of the breadth of the chapters, which is quite extensive and makes it a very useful text for any student of Egyptian politics. There's a lot of really rich empirical content and very helpful theorizing provided by all the contributors. And I came away with seeing a great many parallels between what's going on right now in this period of Egyptian history and our own period of history here in the US. Many of the authors in the volume touch on the increasing consolidation of power in the executive branch and within the coercive institutions of the state, right? The police, the military, and the heightened politicization of judicial institutions, all of which we are also seeing very much in parallel here in the US. The decline of power projection and the decline of influence in global and regional affairs is also another parallel that was really brought out to me as I was going through the book, coupled with, again, the same situation in Egypt, the sort of stubborn unwillingness of the ruling class to sort of recognize or accept this rather diminished capacity on the world stage and on the regional stage, a real intensification of economic inequality, and the almost complete sort of capture of the state's entire institutional apparatus in the service of consolidating this economic dominance of the ruling class, set alongside what we see as an increasing sort of immiseration of the working class and the lower middle class in both countries. And then lastly, the very severe sort of constriction of social and political rights in both societies. I will note that most of the contributors in this text are themselves Egyptian, and so they face some unique threats to their own safety and their ability to engage in research about their own society, which also has very sort of haunting parallels here in the US, where a lot of academics and students and higher education overall is very much sort of in the crosshairs of the current government. So I know that we in the US can and should continue to take lessons and learn from what Egyptians and others have endured during eras of authoritarian retrenchment. And I hope we can also learn about ways to push back against that and sort of learn and work through this, at least today here together. So I will, with that, turn it over to Bob, who will give us sort of a broad overview of the book, and then I will bring in the author chapters specifically.
Thank you, Shana. Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm sure we'll want to return to the parallels not only between Egypt and the United States, but other countries as well with the rise of authoritarianism. And I'd like to thank you and the director, Melanie McAllister, for hosting us. Very kind of you to do so. And Nathan, a co-author here, who is the middleman between the book and the Institute, and is here to give us an overview of his very fine chapter as well, as is May, who has taken it upon herself to place authoritarianism within the context of its limitations of foreign policy. So it's a very nice gathering. I'm very pleased to be part of it, and want to issue an apology for Abd al Fattah, who's very sad not to be here today. He's not able to join us. And he is the conceptualizer of this book. And this was no mean effort. It goes back to 2020, 2021, when a conference was held in Doha, quite a large gathering, to investigate what Sisi had termed his new country, the New Republic, or the Second Republic. And by this stage, it was clear that he was half right and half wrong in that regard. It was new in the sense that the civilian cover for military rule in Egypt, going back to 1952, had basically been completely stripped away. That the New Republic, or Second Republic, was entirely a different and much tougher phenomenon than all that had gone before it. It was not true in the sense that it was a republic, not that it ever truly was, but it more closely resembled the prototype of a government chosen through free and fair electoral and other means, because that is clearly no longer even a shadow of some sort of semblance of legitimate rule in that regard. So the investigation is of this new republic, and it was done, as Shana has just said, primarily by Egyptians, with Nathan and another author, as well as myself, who were sort of, I don't want to say we were free riders on it, but the heavy lifting was done not only by Abd al Fattah, but by Egyptians, including May, who, by trying to do research in Egypt, have either been forced out of the country or who must be extremely careful about it. And so the book is unique in that it is the collective effort of people who have a dog in this fight. These are people who are truly engaged in the subject very directly, about which they write, and who have the analytical capacities to understand them not just as a personal relationship with the regime, but a structural one. And so the book to me is far and away the most informative, empirically based, exciting book on Sisi's Egypt. It's the most up to date. It started 5 years ago, as I say, but each of these chapters has been revised at least once along the way, and all of them were updated before final publication. So the book is very much up to date. Now, just to shift a little bit here to the condemnation, as I was suggesting, of this new republic, the most empirical measures of it falling short of the idea of the notion of a republic are both political and economic. And just to give you some idea of the slide of Egypt from a pretense of some sort of a republic is the rule of law index of the World Judicial Project, which those of you who are familiar with that project know that it's an offshoot of the American Bar Association. It dates back about 20 years, and it's a ranking of 142 countries around the world on the basis of their degree of rule of law. Egypt, out of the 142 countries this year, ranks 135. There's 6 subdimensions of this rule of law index. Fundamental rights, Egypt ranks 140. On constraints on government power, it ranks 140th out of 142 countries. And it ranks 141st out of 142 countries on open government. So this is a government that's as closed and repressive almost as you can possibly be, at least according to the rule of law index. As far as the economy, the performance, which is more empirically measured, these are impressionistic measures on the rule of law index by experts in the field. Egypt's GDP per capita has remained basically unchanged for the last 9 years. It was about $3,200 in 2016. It remains that today. This does not take account of inflation. Egypt is caught in a debt trap, with 2/3 of the budget now being devoted to debt servicing. We have not, since 2021, had the release from the Central Agency for Public Mobilization and Statistics of its annual family surveys, which record, among other things, the level of impoverishment. The attempts to construct from the data that is available the degree of poverty, the last figure I saw was 37%. That was last month. The figure when it was last released in 2021 was the lower 20s. So there's been a significant increase in impoverishment. Egypt's sovereign debt is the 4th riskiest in the world in terms of the level of the credit default swap, which means that the interest payments on Egyptian sovereign debt, depending on the length of time of the bond issue, between 1 day and 10 years, are in all cases over 20%. On its Euro bonds, which were not issued from 2021 until January of 2025 because no one would buy them, have now been issued, and the interest issuing rate was 10%. So Egypt is a analogy to Lebanon in that it's basically running a Ponzi scheme of trying to attract hot money at very high interest rates, rolling the debt over with incoming monies, but not increasing local production and exports to the degree that can actually reduce the debt. So both in political and economic terms, the new republic is a failure. So this raises the question, and indeed it's the question that the book seeks to answer. How can a regime that's performing so badly and repressing its people and impoverishing ever greater numbers of them is able to hang in there? And the way there, as Shana said, this is an empirically rich book. It was not meant to be a theoretically sophisticated one. The idea was to keep the theorizing to as minimal as level as possible, to allow basically Egyptians to tell their tale within the framework that they really chose to do it. But what that came up with was really quite a simple organizational framework for the book, and I think a reasonable theoretical framework more generally to look at Egypt. It was a a triangular relationship between legitimacy, soft power in the first instance, hard power in the second, and then Egypt's relations with the world in the third. Now, to go to the first category here, and the chapters are organized according to this framework. We have used the term soft power as well as the term legitimacy because soft power is the term normally used and was coined for the projection of power internationally. It wasn't coined to substitute as a term for legitimation domestically. So why use the term soft power when we're talking about the ability of the regime to ingratiate itself with its own public? It's because it seems more analogous. The regime is so distant from its own people. There's no two-way legitimation process. It's a one-way process of this regime and the state seeking to project itself onto its own people and convince them of its right to rule. So this is much more analogous then to Joseph Nye's idea of soft power than it is to legitimation, which implies some degree, typically, of interaction between peoples and their rulers. So we use this term interchangeably, but wanting to emphasize the limits on legitimation. So there are 5 chapters that take up this issue. Imad ad-Din Shaheen sets the general framework for it. So the other 4 chapters sort of fit into that framework. The next one is Muhammad Affan's on ideology. And Muhammad does a very nice job in centralizing the state as the core concept of the ideology of the regime. Everything is for the state. Any attempt to challenge the state is treasonous, that the state is your protector. So classic fascists sort of focus on the state, and Muhammad illustrates that very nicely. Bruce Rutherford then takes up the question of legitimacy in a very direct way, which is his consideration of education. Education and health are the 2 public service areas that impact the lives of citizens more directly than any others. And education in particular, education is a hot issue even in the dead political environment of Egypt. And so when an attempt was made, when Bruce was originally writing this chapter, with a $500 million support program from the World Bank to upgrade Egypt's basically failing educational system, it became enormously controversial and was ultimately buried as the regime moved, as it has into every single area, moved directly into education, creating a parallel education system modeled, whether explicitly or implicitly is not clear, but modeled on the old NASPO schools that created the Hitler Jugend. Direct control in the case of Germany under the Nazi Party, in the case of Egypt under the military. So it's as if the military government had turned its back on civilian education, civilian public education in Egypt, and decided it wanted cadres rather than educated citizens. So Bruce goes into that and shows the fundamental failures, therefore, of public education in the country. Then Muhammad takes up the issue of religious legitimation or projection of power, soft power. And he does so by tracing relations between al-Azhar and the regime. And what he comes up with is there's a trade-off here, that Sisi has granted the Sheikh al-Azhar a certain amount of institutional autonomy of al-Azhar in exchange for offers at an ideological level, at a public relations level, of support by the Sheikh and therefore al-Azhar for the regime. So it's a trade-off of a sort of, if you will, vague Islamic endorsement of this regime for the more practical, at least in the eyes of the Sheikh al-Assad, one assumes, of a certain amount of autonomy to sort of do as he would like, and in some cases sort of challenge the very notion of legitimacy of the regime. And then the last chapter is one that Shana mentioned that I did on the economy, and we may come back to that. The second category of chapters is that of hard power. There are 3 chapters here. Abd al Fattah did the first chapter, which is directly on the military. It focuses on the expansion of military powers and on the need for Sisi to coup-proof, which he has done very adroitly and in ways quite different than his predecessors. That's followed by a chapter by Hussam al-Hamalawi, who has done a very insightful job of revealing what happened to the Ministry of Interior and the forces under its control, including the police, in the wake of 2011. That this ministry, above all others, was responsible for the brutal treatment of demonstrators and the killing of them ultimately at Rabaa al-Adawi, most notably. And so he traces it case by case with some of the prominent and most egregious abusers of Egyptian human rights. And in all cases, without exception, they are let off, they are shifted sideways, they are promoted, they are rewarded, but in no case are they punished. The third chapter is by Walid Salam, who updates some of Nathan's work on the judiciary. And what Walid, who paid himself a price, not as bad as Giulio Regeni, the Italian who was tortured to death in 2016, the graduate student, but was himself arrested and did spend time in incarceration. Walid's finding was that the military, indeed, as Bruce found with regard to the educational system, has really colonized the judiciary and the legal judicial system as a whole. Not only has it been degraded and deprived of autonomy, the military has actually moved into this sector, as it has moved into every other sector in the country, to dominate it quite directly. The last section is on Egypt's relations with the rest of the world, and I won't preempt onto May Darwish's time or space here to talk about the shortcomings of its ability to project its power, except to note that for the last 10 years, Egypt in every year has been one of the top 10 spenders in the world on the military. And yet the results of these expenditures has fallen far short of an ability to project power, at least as measured to what Egypt had done historically up until the time Sisi became president. And then the last chapter in that section is by Mutaz al-Fughairi, and Mutaz notes that it is no longer possible to operate an effective human rights system within Egypt. And so he then takes up the issue of the relative effectiveness of offshore global human rights organizations to impact the situation in Egypt. Then finally, in what we can call a concluding section, Nathan very cleverly it goes into the lesion of any gaps between state, regime, and ruler. That these are all one and the same, that the patriotism owed to the state is necessarily, therefore, owed to the regime and to the ruler himself. And this is not a voluntary choice. This is a mandatory one for citizens. And then I talk a little bit about the relations between soft power, hard power, and international relations. And the basic theme here is that the more of one, the less of another. The greater the soft power or legitimacy, necessarily the less need for projection of power internationally or for hard power. But regrettably, given the relative weakness of soft power and the absence of any sort of procedural legitimacy, then it is hard power that is most predominant in Egypt. And so the book reflects, it seems to me, that sort of hydraulic relationship between these three categories. And I think none of the authors would disagree that the relative shortcomings of the regime and its performance, whether internationally or domestically, have called forth the need for it to be enormously coercive in a way that Egypt has not known in its modern history, and then opens us up to the question of how do they maintain power other than in a coercive way. And there are some speculations in the book throughout that. We may want to come back to that. But I've certainly spoken long enough, and I'll kick it back to you, Shana.
Thanks so much, Bob. Wonderful overview. I hope all the students here are taking notes so you can convince your professor that you've read the entire book and have a thoughtful conversation with them. So yes, I'll invite May Darwich, please, to give us an overview and comment on your chapter in particular regarding Egypt's sort of power projection capabilities and its relationships with other states in the region. Please, May.
Thank you, Shana, very much. And thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. So my chapter is very focused on the issue of foreign policy and Egypt's relationship with its environment. And the chapter starts with posing that kind of evolution of Egyptian foreign policy, of how it has changed from being or claiming of being a regional leader in the Arab world during Nasser's era to the current situation where Egypt is currently surrounded by crises and problems along its borders, and it's unable to play an active role in any of it. Instead, we see that Egypt's power and influence has even receded in many areas, like in the Arab-Israeli conflict, or even previously in the Levant. And we'll see now in the last 10 years, for example, Egypt has hardly played any role in the Syria crisis. And somewhat to understand this kind of decline, scholars have advanced various explanations, some related to the economic situation in Egypt, domestic pressure, others related to the leadership, that Mubarak over 30 years was more or less unwilling to play an active role, and his personality was rather keen to kind of maintain a status quo, not a very ambitious leader. And somehow Sisi continued on his path. Other explanations kind of also pose the fact that the region has changed. Other regional actors, especially after 2011, saw an opportunity in increasing their role, their power, especially the Gulf state. So the explanation to this kind of decline are various, but my chapter is not just concerned to trace these kind of explanations or the drivers behind this decline, but it's rather focusing on a very specific issue that has arisen with this decline, which is the dissonance between what Egypt can do and what Egyptian leaders are actually claiming that they're able to do. In other words, it's a dissonance between policy and discourse. And this dissonance is kind of like present in many of our theoretical literature, in our knowledge from previous cases of great powers and regional powers that have declined over the time. And with this kind of decline, the leaders are often denying this decline and unwilling to change the identity that's associated with the role. So I used role theory to kind of highlight this problem in Egyptian foreign policy at the moment, showing how the behavioral aspect of the foreign policy has definitely changed since Nasser. And under Sisi in particular, it became evident that the decline is definitely happening. It's not a question of doubting Egyptian capacity or capability in the region anymore, but it's definitely a declining regional power that's unable to play an effective role, even in the crises that's happening on its borders. For example, the crisis in Sudan, the Gaza war, Libya, and more importantly, the Grand Renaissance Dam that is threatening Egypt's share in the Water Nile. So we'll see that Egypt has faced so many crises, even in the Red Sea with the Houthis. Somewhat it's unable to formulate an effective and a creative foreign policy to deal with these crises. And its behavior has been more or less a reactive one. It's just how to maintain a status quo, how to avoid escalating these problems further without necessarily having a coherent and consistent foreign policy towards these issues. But at the same time, and what's really striking is that we find the leaders and the elite and the media associated with the regime in general are kind of telling us a different story. That Egypt under Sisi is coming back to retrieve its regional leadership. That Egypt will be the main leader of Eastern Africa, that nobody's going to be able to touch Egypt's water in the Nile, and that somewhat Egypt is no longer a country that is declining, but it's rather a country that's claiming back its position and its natural leadership in the Arab world. And we find these kind of discourses and statements in the media, in official statements, even by Sisi, and somewhat this kind of dissonance is creating a problem in our understanding of foreign policy in general, but it's also revealing a problem of stagnation in Egyptian foreign policy. If the role of Egyptian foreign policy is changing from a leader, it has to change to something else. But if the leaders and the elites are not really recognizing that change, they remain attached and rather hostage to a certain conception of their role in the region. But they are really unable to execute it, and therefore we have a stagnant foreign policy, an ineffective policy that's necessarily not really dealing with the situation in an optimal way. And we can see these kind of stagnations happening in the GERD, that on the one hand, to just give a very quick kind of overview of that particular case study, that East Africa is changing, it's developing, Ethiopia is growing, and it has kind of like ambitions to grow further economically. And definitely the inherited problems from colonialism are no longer accepted by the rising elites in Ethiopia. One of these is the share and the divide of the share of the Water Nile, and hence the GERD. And this kind of project was planned since the 1960s, but Egypt was able to prevent it from happening until 2011. After 2011, it became very clear that Ethiopia is increasing in power, Egypt is declining, and there is somehow a shift in the balance that's allowing Ethiopia to execute this project. But at the same time, Egypt failed to realize that this is a changing moment in history. And instead of negotiating, instead of trying to find a compromise for over a decade, Egypt has just insisted that they're not going to change their position, that they have the rights in these kind of colonial inherited agreements to maintain a certain share in the Water Nile. And somewhat, Egypt became isolated by many countries in East Africa, and Ethiopia was able to execute the dam. Egypt did not succeed in dissuading Ethiopia, preventing it, or diplomatically pressuring it in any way. So here we found that the elites over the decade, they were very holding on to the idea that Egypt could prevent Ethiopia from happening like it did decades ago. And hence they didn't really change their foreign policy. They were not able to imagine a different role for Egypt in the region. And the result was a stagnant foreign policy that led to another crisis. And the same thing that's happening in Gaza, the same thing happening in the Sudan crisis, or even in the Houthis and the Red Sea crisis at the moment. So the chapter is kind of showing how these kind of dissonance and how these kind of contradictions are leading to an ineffective foreign policy. And in the end, the case of Egypt is a case of a declining regional power. Eventually, the elites and the regime will have to catch up with this kind of reality, but it might take a very long time, or it might take shorter time. We cannot predict that, but we have many cases worldwide, like the case of the United Kingdom, of a declining great power, but at the same time, the elite are still kind of holding on to the identity of a great power. And we can have many other examples in the world, in the history, where there is often a lag between the changing role of a great or a regional power and somehow to what extent the elites have managed to catch up with that reality. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop here and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, May. So now I'll turn to Nathan to give us all a lesson in political science, to tell us about sort of this process of, as Bob said, elision and sort of blurring the boundaries between what is the ruler, what is the regime, and then what is the state, and the service that does to keeping Sisi in power. Please, Nathan, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me actually just begin by echoing a couple things that Bob said at the beginning. The subject matter of this book wasn't always fun, but the process was fun. I mean, you just learn a lot. Bob mentioned sort of some of the empirical richness and the depth of the book, but also its real breadth. I mean, we just heard from maybe about foreign policy. We're talking about judiciary, educational system. If you were to put a book about Egypt together, say, a generation or two ago, it just wouldn't have had the same kind of breadth or expertise. So this was just a fun project to be part of. Bob also said that the emphasis was to be empirical, not conceptual. So I was cutting against the grain a little bit, but trying to harness that to some empirical insights. And essentially, what I'm sort of starting with is, there's almost a convention when you're dealing with political systems in the global South. If we were to talk about German politics, we would be talking about political parties, processes, social realities, and social change, and that sort of thing. And we'd be talking about specific people and so on, but probably much less. But when we go to political systems that are less familiar, we often get very personal very quickly. The regime is this way because this is what the ruler wants, and there's a sort of analytical elision among ruler, regime, and state. And I'm not saying in this chapter that never makes sense. I'm saying it varies in how much sense it makes. And what's remarkable, I would think, about the current period is that elision. In a sense, it does make sense more now than most times in the past. That one of the challenges for Egypt's rulers and Egypt's regimes historically has been managing really a kind of a vast state apparatus that is active in foreign policy, as we just heard from May, but it's also active in economic policy. It's active in education. It has all these different religious apparatus, media apparatus, and so forth, and so on. And the way that there's been just some evolution in how these have been managed. So I think one thing I'm trying to add is a little bit of historical perspective. And yeah, all regimes have been authoritarian, but they've been authoritarian sometimes in different ways. In the 1960s, you had a single political party. And you had probably at the top of the system kind of a fairly narrow elite, but they used specific tools in order to control the system. And my view, actually, that kind of system evolved in the 70s, 80s under the Sadat and Mubarak presidency. It wasn't that Sadat and Mubarak were irrelevant or above all kinds of attempts to manage the system and to control these institutions, but they realized an awful lot more autonomy. They were often kept in loyal hands. There were ways in which they were sort of coaxed along, but they also sometimes could kind of form their own agenda in ways that might be annoying to the regime and sometimes offensive to the ruler and so on. And that had a real effect in 2011 when you actually saw large parts of the state apparatus joining in challenges to the regime, bringing down the ruler. So let me talk about the current period. It is different, I think, from the past, even from the Nasser period, which is probably the most centralized. Right? So there's no real political party. I mean, there are these things on paper, but they simply do not have. I mean, the Arab Socialist Union had real structures associated with it. It owned the newspapers, it controlled the professional associations, and right now we have sort of Nation's Future Party, which doesn't really have any kind of ideology or structure. It's just a grouping of parliamentarians to give the expected majority. There are ways, and Bob made mention of this in Willie Sellon's chapter in the judiciary, which was probably the institution whose autonomy, that and El-Azhar were the ones where the autonomy was perhaps most dramatic. You have ways in which just structurally, they have been brought into just the laws establishing them have given the president a much more authority over them, and that authority has been used in much more of a way to actually put these institutions in the hands of people who are extremely loyal to the regime, and most famously when the head of the military courts was placed on the Constitutional Court, one of these bodies that I think was never threatened to the old regime, but was kind of annoying to it. Well, it's not going to annoy them again under these new arrangements. There are other things that are going on as well. There are all these programs for sort of recruiting challenging youth and sort of training them, kind of building up this cadre that is, Bob mentioned of some of the ideological aspects of the book that is really kind of imbuing them with this ideology that points to valorization of the state. It's not about Arab socialism. It's not about nationalism. It's just the state and stability is good. The military is good. It's a dangerous world out there. All this stuff about fourth generation warfare and so on, almost this kind of a conspiratorial view. And the training is not only for youth, but it's also for key personnel in throughout the state apparatus. They're expected to go through these training courses. And the training courses are run by the military. So you've got the military, really, not just military officers, as existed in the 50s and 60s, of free officers sort of running key institutions, but the military as an institution, developing its own kind of worldview and inculcating it and becoming this sort of pillar of the state. And the same thing with various internal security bodies, really playing a hand in managing institutions and really kind of pursuing a political vision of that is, again, more concentrated and more personalized around the presidency than in the past. And it's also essentially a regime that doesn't like politics, right? Egypt's earlier rulers were sometimes, they had some idea of how to manipulate, how to act in politics. Egypt's earlier presidents were people like Nasser and Sadat had some sort of political careers. This is a regime that just seems to be saying, leave it to us. We're in charge. We'll call you when we need you, but you're not here to participate. And let me just close with just sort of a comparative note that you mentioned, Shana. So this is a system that is different from Egypt in the past. Again, most regimes have been authoritarian. This is authoritarian in a distinctive and much more highly centralized and much more personalized ways, where the distinctions between ruler, regime, and state, the sort of political science 101, doesn't get you as far as it may have in earlier eras. And there is a global phenomenon going on here, which we sometimes call different names, sometimes populism and so on. But the way in which state institutions are made to be essentially politicized and to serve the interests and sometimes even the personal interests of the head of state. This is a familiar story, an all too familiar story. It's not just an Egyptian story. So kind of the convention that we analyze politics in the global south different than the global north is one that I think a lot of people were wishing today and in this city were more true. And I'll just close on that comparative note about Egyptian unexceptionalism, that what is happening today is maybe part of a global trend.
Thanks so much, Nathan. I'll start with kind of a sort of a broad question that I'm hoping maybe you can all sort of weigh in on or respond to. Um, so there's, this common sort of conception, which I first read about, I think, in the work of Samer Soliman, the late scholar from AUC, who was a wonderful observer of Egyptian politics and economics. But that Egypt always is on the cusp of some crisis, and then something quite dramatic happens to sort of abate that immediate sort of crisis moment. So in the 1970s, right, there's a global debt crisis really for the entire global South or third world, and Egypt is heavily in debt, and then sort of switches from a Soviet client state to an American client state. And with that switch, right, there is a huge windfall of investment and military aid and economic aid from the United States that sort of pulls them out of that abyss. And then in 1990, the state is again on the verge of bankruptcy. You have the start of the first Gulf War. Egypt agrees to cooperate with the United States and has a huge portion of their large debt forgiven, and then gets lots of new assistance and aid in exchange for that collaboration. And then in 2011, after the uprisings, there's obviously a lot of dislocation in the economy. And the Gulf states this time are the ones who step in. First, I guess, a little bit more from Qatar, right, when Morsi was president, and you can sort of track some of the projects that were the investment flows, a lot of which were coming from Qatar in that beginning era. And then after 2013, a lot of money from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates investment. And then, I think a lot of people here probably heard the recordings, right, where Sisi was talking bad about the Gulf states, and it caused a huge sort of PR fiasco because they were giving a lot of money to sort of prop up the Egyptian central bank, and this became sort of a bit of a controversy. So what do you sort of see as the current crises? What are the sort of regional developments and events that you think might sort of play into that crisis? How is Sisi going to try to sort of leverage sort of regional events to support his own regime and his own sort of longevity as ruler in Egypt? Bob, yeah, okay. And then we can
Thanks,
go down the
Shana.
line.
The theme that you have nicely explicated historically as it's unfolded since the Nasser era is basically get with the powerful, which Egypt has been very good at doing. So Nasser got with the Arab nationalist movement and the Soviet Union. Sadat shifted horses at a strategic time, and Mubarak then tightened that relationship. And so Sisi has basically behaved in more or less the same way, but the nature of the powerful has changed in all these cases. And I think the powerful now, as both you, Shana, and Nathan have laid out, is sort of global authoritarianism. And so Sisi fits quite well into that new power structure. He's an example of then leading a state that is not going to indulge, far from indulging terrorists. It's not even going to indulge its own citizens. And that's perfectly in keeping not only with the attitude and approach of people in the Gulf, but it's increasingly true of people in the United States and elsewhere. And that manifests itself in the foreign support that Sisi receives from all of those countries. There is not a single country, other than, let's say, Ethiopia, which is not willing now to reach out and support the Sisi regime, whether it's China, Russia, the United States, the European Union, and so on and so forth. And so, in a sense, Sisi has backed a winner. The problem is, and here's where the Sisi regime differs from its predecessors, what is it having to give up to get that support? And what it's having to give up is ever more of its sovereignty. And it's most noticeable in terms of land. So the selling off of strategic parts of Egypt, whether to the Emiratis or to the Saudis, most notably, is, it started with the two islands that came into question in 2016, Senafir and Tehran, that were caught up in the three-way relationship between Israel, Saudi, and Egypt, and which caused a furore. And Sisi was able to navigate through that and obtain the support from the Saudis for so doing. And that model has now been generalized, whether it's in Ras Al Hikmah on the northwest coast, or now in the Red Sea and out north of Ghardaa, in the Gulf of Suez with the Saudis. So Sisi is having to give ever more ground in the face of his benefactors, which is one of the great vulnerabilities that the regime has. And it was indeed the reactions against the ceding of sovereignty to Saudi of this Tehran and Sanafir, that was probably the most powerless moment that Sisi has faced in his career. So it's an enormously sensitive issue. It's lurking there. And when and if the Egyptians decide that they really want to become vocally critical of the regime, then these matters will rise to the very top of it. So there's a deal with the devil here. And the devil is ever more powerful, the devil being the outside forces I'm just referring to. And Sisi is having to cut them an ever bigger slice. So Egypt's autonomy, despite all the claims by the current regime to be in reinforcing the powers of Egypt and so on, it has never been weaker than it is today.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob. May, would you care to comment?
Yes, thank you very much. I think there's an Egyptian proverb that often says that catastrophes do not come singular, they come as a group. And I think that's exactly what happened to Egypt since Sisi came. There's a crisis after the other, there's a crisis after the other. And surprisingly, the regime managed to get out of them. And I think that's often where most of the social scientists keep failing at predicting and at often anticipating that there will be a regime change. And we're often caught in this kind of mistake that these crises will lead to a change and then they don't. And at the points where nobody's expecting that the change would happen, they do happen, like the Arab uprisings. So it's very, let's say, it's a very risky business to kind of discuss how the Egyptian regime is kind of expected to get out of these current crises. But so far they've managed, sometimes by luck, sometimes the circumstances kind of helped. Sometimes it's maneuvering different actors, like when the US and Europe refused to fund some of Sisi's project, the Gulf kind of supported. And when the Gulf kind of said, no, it's enough, and there was a crisis, for some reason, I mean, we all know why. Once the Gaza war started and the Red Sea problem started, European countries and the US came back to support Sisi again. So I think sometimes it's just this kind of playing off actors against each other, but it doesn't mean that this is sustainable in any way, nor it's a long-term kind of solution to the Egyptian regime. But from what we've seen in the past decade, that there has been no long-term planning, not even medium-term planning. It's often a reaction to whatever the current situation is presenting. And that's how the regime has managed to get out of these crises without necessarily finding a permanent solution to any of them. And they might come back to haunt the regime or not, and they might come back decades later. Who knows? I mean, the 1948 war somehow led to the demise of many Arab regimes afterwards and monarchies, and it was followed by a decade of coup d'etat in the region. It has taken 4 years in Egypt, but it has taken 10 years in Iraq. So for sure, we know that there will be change and the situation is untenable, but we cannot really predict what's going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, May, so much. Nathan, do you want to comment on that question or?
I don't really have a lot to add. No.
Okay. May, actually, if I can just keep asking something about that. And then we do have one question. I will in the Q&A, I'll go to that afterward. Bob, you also sort of mentioned this, is that as they keep sort of acceding to the demands of the Gulf states or different external actors, that also results in a chipping away at not only the state's sovereignty, but also the the playing pieces or the chess pieces that they have to use sort of in future negotiations and in future attempts to sort of balance regional actors against each other, most specifically and clearly and materially in the case of the 2 islands that they had to return right to Saudi Arabia. So do you see in Egypt's sort of previous role, as a sort of regional hegemon, more playing pieces like that being sort of given up by the regime in its in Sisi's sort of desire to maintain power that is weakening, again, thinking about Nathan's chapter, weakening the state, even if it's cementing Sisi's sort of individual power over the state.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I think one of the main drivers of the foreign policy, if we look at why they are maintaining such a foreign policy, it is really for domestic purposes in the way that they are creating a new economic class in Egypt that is loyal to the military regime. And if we see that how most of the funding that the Sisi use, that's coming from aid, that's coming from tax collection, that's coming, and let's say the infrastructure projects that are currently being built in Egypt, they are all given to specific companies that are associated with the military regime one way or another. And if we look at how this aid has been distributed economically inside Egypt and what the money has come to serve, it has come to serve this particular purpose of how to restructure Egypt's kind of social class system in a way to create a new class that's very much associated with the regime. So even that foreign policy, it's not really aiming at expanding Egypt's power to the outside or actually using Egypt's power for the sake of increasing its status or enhancing its economic capacity, but it's rather for that domestic purpose of regime survival. So in a way, these kind of like dynamics, we've seen they've been there before during Mubarak, but they were never kind of used to that extent. And I think that's really the change that we've seen under the Sisi regime, that these kind of changes are significant. They're, let's say, extremely overwhelming on the Egyptian economy and also on the social structure. It is, I think it's as important as the 1952 revolution and how it changed the structure of the society. And I think what the regime has done in the last 10 years is not less significant than this. The problem with the foreign policy that it has long-term effect on Egypt's role. You cannot change a foreign policy one day and then the following day adopt a foreign policy. You cannot change an identity and then the following day. It's exactly what Sadat did. He did a shift in Egyptian foreign policy, but until now, we see how the different leaders are mostly wedded to this new foreign policy. So in a way, the foreign policy is used as a tool for other purposes, but eventually it will become a burden, and it will become, let's say, a constraint on what Egypt can do regionally, but also domestically.
Thank you. So actually, Nathan, this question is for you. From Abdullah Ramah. He says, Professor Brown talks about the overreach of the presidency and the state security apparatus into the judiciary. Azhar, on the other hand, seems to have maintained some relative autonomy. What explains the relative resilience of an institution like Al-Azhar? And does it present a blueprint for how other state institutions can maintain some autonomy?
I think it's a great question, and it's something that strikes people when they look at Egyptian politics today. It's interesting that it strikes people because Al-Azhar's reputation, sort of in the Islamic world in the 60s and 70s, was of having been co-opted by the state, and now it seems to be having some autonomy. And I think what's going on here is, I referred to the judiciary under the Mubarak regime as being like annoying but not threatening. And that's essentially the position of Al-Azhar today. It is certainly not challenging the regime. There's this famous moment where the president is giving a speech and calls out the Sheikh Al-Azhar, you wear me out. And that probably gets it right. There's sort of a roadblock for some of the changes when the regime cracked down on independent student groups and universities. Al-Azhar was the last one. Just moving there is a little bit dicey. So what explains that? There's one legal and one sort of social factor, I think. The legal is that Al-Azhar just legally and institutionally retains an autonomy that it won actually back in 2011, 2012, which is to say that the leadership of the institution is self-perpetuating. There's this group of senior scholars who appoint the Grand Imam, and the first members of that group of senior scholars were appointed by the Grand Imam. So there's a level of kind of self-perpetuation that's there in law that was actually put there by the military, perhaps anticipating that this would insulate Al-Azhar from the control of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this was back when they were expecting the Muslim Brotherhood to perhaps do well in parliamentary elections. So that's why it's their institution. But I think there's something socially going on as well, and that is Al-Azhar, it has a nationwide network of schools. It's got all these alumni. It's got a constituency. Egyptians sort of take some pride about its international role. So it's not like the judiciary, which maybe benefits, everybody but nobody in particular. An independent judiciary, independent Al-Azhar has people standing up for it, and it's got the current Grand Imam is one who has has garnered now strong support in the institution. So is it a model? No, I don't think so. And I'm not sure how sustainable it would be over the very long term. And here's why. Earlier on in the regime, there looked like there were efforts to rein some of this autonomy in, to build up the Ministry of Religious Affairs, which actually, oversees most of the country's mosques, to sort of rejigger where power sat within the religious establishment. There was even talk about amending the law of Al-Azhar. I think the confrontation has kind of died down, and neither side seems to want to have a full public confrontation. This incident back in 2017, where there was actually a public, muted but still public confrontation, just hasn't been repeated. So they're basically everybody's getting along right now. But over the long term, my sense is that when the current Grand Imam retires, they're sort of biding their time, and this doesn't sound to me like something that other state institutions can repeat or can mimic. They just don't have the same kind of constituency. They don't have the same kind of legal basis. In a sense, many of them have lost it, and I think it's more likely that Al-Azhar gradually, especially after the current Grand Imam leaves office, will be brought to heel a little bit more.
Thanks, Nathan. So I think this is a question that could go really also potentially to everyone. This is from Salma Mashhour. She says, there was always an assumption that Egypt is too big to fail. Is there a danger that this is becoming less and less the case with the rise of other powers in the region? Bob, I mean, I know that a lot of your focus is on the economy. Obviously, the currency of the realm is currency, right? And all of the currency is in a particular place in the Middle East, and it's not Egypt. So this might be a question that you could address. And then also, May, this obviously clearly, the decline of Egypt as a cultural and sort of diplomatic sort of epicenter in the region, and the rise of Qatar and other countries engaged in diplomacy, if you want to touch on that. And also, Nathan, even in the sense of I guess, institutional ties maybe between like institutions in Egypt like Al-Azhar, and then those sort of parallel institutions in other countries. Is Al-Azhar and the sort of storied Egyptian judiciary, I know they obviously have transnational ties with other countries in the region, but is the sort of influence shifting in that respect too? And is that weakening those institutions vis-a-vis Sisi in particular? Bob, do you want to go ahead and start?
All right. Well, the idea that Egypt is too big to fail doesn't mean that it projects its power adequately, as May has been telling us. It means that if it does fail, the threats are quite significant, not only to its immediate neighbors, but even beyond that, beyond the Mediterranean. And so it's sort of the idea that it's a basket case. And this is a basket that, if it were to break, would be extremely problematical for all sorts of parties, and therefore they're willing to support it. But one gets tired of charity, and that's sort of what's happening. And the charity that's provided World Bank, IMF, European Union, and so on, but in less so by the Arab Gulf states, is partly being aggravated, the aid fatigue, by global downturn in foreign assistance, led first by the Trump administration, but copied now in Europe and elsewhere, that you have to play the game. And so the Lebanese were past masters at dressing up their economy as something that was going to succeed if it just had another tranche. And that finally ran out of gas in 2019. In Egypt, May really put her finger on it, I think, with the idea of the gap between policy and discourse. So the Egyptians are past masters at what another word for this would be called lying. So you present the idea that you are going to privatize military-owned companies. You present the idea that GDP growth is going to gradually enable the country to reduce its foreign debt, and so on and so forth. And so just as the Lebanese hired McKinsey and Company to draft their vision, so did Egypt do the same, the Vision 2030. The Vision 2030 is as far from reality as the Lebanese one was, and that being widely recognized, the Egyptians in the last week have come up with a new thing called the Narrative of Economic Development. It's a 700-page document, which has been released precisely at the time that the IMF is engaged in a review for the upcoming tranche of the $5 billion loan it agreed to last year. So what this is just an accumulation of paper that really doesn't indicate government intent at all. It's simply playing to the foreign audience, so they in turn can tell their constituencies, well, see, Egypt is really intending to do this, and so the money we give them now will accomplish the independent economic base of Egypt, and so on and so forth. This, however, has been going on a bit long, and just as in Lebanon, people finally got fed up with it and said enough is enough. So does Egypt, it seems to me, possibly enter into that area of danger, that because it is so willing to lie, and because those lies have in no case related in any reality whatsoever with regard to the economy, that it is going to get harder and harder for politicians in the West, especially, to sell the idea that providing billions to Egypt is a good idea and that ultimately will bring about a fundamental change in the place. So there's that. On the Gulf side, clearly they ran out of patience quite a long time ago, and they said, look, if we're going to provide more money, we want land, we want some of your most vital companies, we want to be involved in your financial sector. So the Gulfies, who are sharper, it seems to me, and it's after all their turf, really are now very directly exploiting Egypt's weakness. That, I think, is going to come more with foreign assistance generally provided by the West and elsewhere. And so I would not be, I would reinforce what May just said, namely that this inability on the part of Egypt to effectively use its resources, whether military, financial, or otherwise, or human, is hugely costly, and it's inevitably going to undermine confidence in the regime. And being too big to fail can run out of gas. And I think in the light of current attitudes in the world about foreign assistance, it's likely to run out of gas rather sooner than we thought some time ago.
May, did you want to elaborate on that, or?
Yeah, I think Bob covered everything, but I think I would just add one thing, even that kind of like statement that Egypt is too big to fail, we cannot just take it as face value. It is also part of this idea that somehow we cannot really acknowledge what is happening in Egypt, and this is the natural evolution of Egypt's decline. It will have to decline. It will have to hit like a very low point, and then things will have to change eventually. And I think in a way, trying to just maintain the situation as it is, it's just impossible in a way. And there will be an evolution. I mean, there will be an evolution of Egypt's role in the region, of the economy, of the political system. We just don't know how this is going to happen, but we know for sure that the situation is untenable. And also there is a particular kind of like politicization of that statement. It's rather kind of often used by the regime to leverage the resources, to leverage the aid, that you cannot let Egypt kind of go through this. And this was a way of extracting money from donors. But at the same time, this narrative is not really being directed at the public opinion in Egypt. So it's rather a statement that's often projected to the outside, but on the inside, how the regime is protecting or is projecting other kind of statements is quite staggering. Like this idea of لا لتقزيم Egypt, like you cannot make Egypt small. And this is often kind of given to the public consumption, which is total opposite to this kind of statement that's, you know, that's kind of directed to the outside. And that is usually quite interesting to see and make these kind of comparisons to which kind of audience this is being targeted to. But in general, at the domestic level, there is a whole other mobilization around other kind of slogans and statements. Thank you.
Nathan, did you want to comment, or should I can move to the next question too?
Yeah, you could go on to the next one, yes.
Well, I don't have one. I mean, I have one. I don't have one from the audience, but okay. So my question is so I'm thinking about sort of what are the sources of potential domestic opposition. And one thing that I saw recently was sort of the end of rent control in large sort of urban neighborhoods in Cairo, especially around the main cemetery. These sort of archaeologically and sort of sensitive heritage sort of historical sites. My assumption is that this is an effort, obviously, to get most of the sort of urban poor moved out of these sort of valuable central urban landscapes in order to free that up for Gulf capital investment. But of course, Egyptians are also very aware of where that investment is coming from and why these literally millions, probably eventually, once the program is in full force, are being kicked out of their homes. And Nathan, this is where it sort of touches also on your chapter. Sisi can sort of can blame the Gulf states, right, for that, because that's where the investment capital is coming from, and also the ministries that actually enforce and manage that process, right? The different ministries that interact with the individuals that are being evicted from those low cost, low income units, and the landlords who are probably not going to be able to afford to actually keep those units, because I guess most of them are quite old and need a lot of repairs, and are going to immediately try to want to sell those to Gulf investors. So how does that sort of connection between where these points of pain in terms of potential areas for protest and Gulf investment, and then sort of shifting the blame for these painful processes from Sisi to other institutions within the government, sort of come together to give us a picture of what might happen. Nathan, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a bit speculative on my part, but I think that, yeah, there's an opacity to decision making in some sectors, and certainly economic policy investment is one of those. So that there's actually sometimes debate about some of these things, but in terms of sort of final decisions being made, it seems to be a very, very small circle. That makes it very, very difficult to deflect blame. There are areas, I mean, I said before, there isn't any politics in Egypt. There are areas where there actually is contestation. I mean, the most steady one, I think, is family law, personal status law reform, where there actually is so much argumentation going on, and so many different groups with their own desires to change it in this way or to keep it that way, that you haven't seen any change. So there's politics in that area, but when it comes to economic policy, when it comes to investment, no. So the regime does kind of own that. How does that translate into any kind of opposition, I think, is a really, really difficult question. And I've said this in other contexts. When there was opposition expressed in the past, in the recent past, in Egypt's political history, it came from recognized groups with recognized agendas, right? So there were Islamists, there were socialists, liberals, and that sort of thing. And these people, or these groups, sometimes had formal organizations, but even more than that, they had kind of programs, analyses. You kind of knew what they stood for. And that's not true anymore. Again, because of the clamping down of politics, the clamping down of the media. It's not that Egyptians don't have opinions, but collectively, it's very difficult to organize around them. And again, it varies from issue to issue. It's possible to have a women's rights group say, we need this change. More religiously conservative people say, no, we can't do that. That's possible. But it's not possible to develop alternative economic visions. There's a little bit of pushback from the business community in some areas where they've been able sometimes to get some kind of at least public platform, nationwide economic summits and this sort of thing. But for the most part, what strikes me is again, I just go back to how decision making seems to be centralized and kind of anonymous, and this is something that might lead to inchoate opposition rather than the kind of programmatic politics we saw, a decade or two ago.
May or Bob, do you want to comment on that? I do have another question in from Samar Shahada about domestic pressures around Gaza. If you'd rather comment on that, I'll leave it up to you.
I can comment briefly on the issue of tenancy.
Yeah, that
So
would be wonderful.
yeah, I think Shannon, it's interesting that somewhat how this kind of new law has been passed has been automatically just speculated as somehow it's going to lead, or it's being designed on purpose to serve Gulf investment in Cairo. But at the same time, this has been a very, very long time. And one of the problems that the Nasser regime has created in Egypt is this kind of tenancy law. And for anyone interesting, it's been since the 1960s where people are sort of like allowed to rent a flat, live in it for them and their children for decades with paying very, very minimal amount of rents, and they're not, let's say the landlords are not allowed to kick them out. And this has created a whole social problem that many people are owners of buildings, of apartments, but they're not really either making money of it and they cannot really use it, or even kick out the person who's been living or their children, or even sometimes more than 2 generations living. And to an extent, this is again part of the social changes that the Sisi regime is doing in Egypt. So this is kind of structurally changing the social, let's say, some of the social classes in Egypt. Whether this particular kind of consequence for this law will be used to, let's say, to serve the Gulf investments, serve the state to sell or buy some of these properties, especially in downtown Cairo or in very other, let's say, high spots in Egypt. We don't really know yet, because this is going to take at least 7 years until many of these landlords will be able to take hold of these apartments or buildings. But what is for sure, it's going to happen that this is going to create a very, very big social conflict in Egypt. How it's going to be implemented, how it's going to be, let's say, executed, we have absolutely no idea, especially in the current situation of the absence of the rule of law. We have no idea how this is going to happen, but this is definitely something to watch, how this is going to unfold in the next 5 to 7 years in Egypt, for anyone who's interested in looking at urban changes, anyone looking at the social classes and how this kind of moving across these social classes is going to change, of people who had nothing, they are living in poverty, and all of a sudden they will be sort of owners of buildings again, and they can make millions out of it.
If I could just quickly follow on about the rent law, it seems to me the rent law is a perfect example of the broader phenomenon of growing inequality in the country. And that growing inequality has moved up from the most impoverished to the middle class. This is a regime that has not been defending the interests of the middle and especially the lower middle class, anything but that. So the idea, Shana, that the people who are negatively affected by these changes are going to identify something other than the Sisi regime as being responsible, a ministry, a governor, whatever it might be, I don't think is on the cards. I think, we haven't really looked at a long time at class relations in Egypt, but I think the sort of next chapter of Egyptian political economy is going to have to do so much more directly than it's been doing for quite a long time now. That the behavior, and Nathan mentioned that an inchoate response, that we're not getting policy reactions. This is, after all, the second least information-rich political economy in the world, according to the World Rule of Law Project. So information is not there. In the absence of information, you don't have an educated policy debate at all. What you have is rage. And increasing number of people, maybe now around 40%, are, sort of by the data made available from the Central Agency for Public Mobilization and Statistics, are impoverished. Well, this is sort of suggestive that people are not going to be balanced and go out in the street with their children and go to Midana Tahrir and call for the regime to depart. I think you're looking at something very different than that now. And the rage will be directed at everything to do with the regime. Nothing in particular, I think. Well, it may start in local points, but that could easily fuse into a rejection of the regime and its backers being the Gulf.
Thanks. So we have 4 minutes left. If you each want to use 1 minute, if you'd like to address this question just about the domestic pressures resulting from the genocide in Gaza, is there popular protest? How is it directed toward the government? How is the government responding to that? Nathan or Bob or okay.
Yeah, I'll respond very briefly and extremely impressionistically. I think at the very beginning, back in late 2023, there was some real popular pressure. I mean, and we saw this basically earlier on in Gaza-related conflicts. There was some. I think my impression is it's subsided an awful lot. What could kick it up a lot again would be mass expulsions. The regime says over and over, this is an existential question. So anything that happens in terms of so it will put the regime under real pressure internationally and domestically. But right now, at the current moment, it doesn't seem to be. That's my impression.
May?
Yeah, I agree with Nathan. I think at the beginning, yes, there was definitely some popular pressure, and we can see that the pressure is kind of increasing and decreasing over the last 2.5 years. It's or 2 years. I think we cannot really see that it's been sustainable, but I think this is the case of all popular kind of reactions to any event. It's impossible to have something like this sustained over such a long time, but it doesn't mean that people will not be mobilized if the triggers happen. People are very upset. Everyone remains upset about the situation in Gaza. But at the same time, whether this is going to be translated into pressure on the regime or not, I think we have to look more into the conditions for that to unfold. But the popular anger is definitely still there. But at the very same time, we find that with every kind of trigger from Israel, where Egypt is trying to oppose any plans for relocating Palestinians, we find that there is a popular mobilization and it's successful behind the regime, which is quite surprising. But it's constantly being used by the regime to say, well, I cannot do this. This is a red line for me. And it has been used consistently. And we've seen the last 2 weeks, this is exactly what happened, that there was popular mobilization behind the regime to stand against any plans for relocating Palestinians in Sinai.
Go ahead, Bob.
Just to add my voice to this, I think the reason why the pressure seems less manifest now than it did last year, and even more recently than that, is Israel's egregious behavior. It is so absolutely outrageous that even the Trump administration is having problems dealing with it. But Egypt, which clearly had, the Sisi regime clearly had the best relations with Israel of any modern Egyptian government. Now Egypt is in good company. The verbal distancing of Egypt from Israel, which has picked up pace the last few weeks, is part and parcel of a global movement. And so Egypt doesn't stand out as being hypocritical in the face of this outrageous behavior by Israel. Egypt itself can make very strong statements that seem to be true because everyone else is saying them. So I don't think that the pressure now from the public of Egypt is likely to renew. Because I think the whole world is so now on the other side of that issue that it provides cover to Egypt.
Yeah, that actually makes quite a bit of sense. Thank you, Bob. It's officially 1:30, folks. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you very much for your excellent questions. Thank you, May Darwich, Bob Springborg, and Nathan Brown. And once again, here's the book. There should be a link in the chat where you can find the book and also a link to our upcoming events. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really had a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I hope everyone had a wonderful time and learned a lot as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Shana.
for having
Thank you.
us. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.